Hi everyone, Mr. Casarino, and we're going to be doing the second little flipped classroom lecture video. And for this one, we're still in World War One, and we're going to be looking at mobilizing a nation and fighting the war. For those of you reading at home, this corresponds pretty nicely with your Nash reading that you can see and your Newman reading. So without further ado, let's start taking a look. So World War One was really the first modern mechanized war, and it required vast amounts of resources to equip and provision massive armies and provide them with the tools of combat. The shooting war was dependent on what historians have termed a parallel war of production that kept the military machine running. So in order to fight the war, you need industry to produce the goods needed, like guns and other weapons. So as we know, during the first 2.5 years, the U.S. was a neutral party, and an economic boom occurs primarily from exports. They exported billions of dollars during this time period before entering the war. Primarily, they were exporting American cotton, wheat, brass, rubber, automobiles, machinery, and thousands of other raw and finished goods. And now, according to a 1917 study, exports of metals, machines, and automobiles rose from 480 million in 1913 to about 1.6 billion in 1916. And these same kind of trends are included with food exports and gunpowder. Now, the total cost of America's 19 months of combat was roughly $32 billion, sorry. And this was really raised through taxes on corporate profits and high income earners, and borrowing money from the public mainly through the sale of Liberty bonds, which we'll talk about later. And the government also made its first foray into price controls with the establishment of the War Industries Board, which attempted to create a priority system for the fulfillment of government contracts, set quota and efficiency standards, and allocated raw materials based on needs. Uh, so American involvement in the war was so short that the impact of the War Industries Board, or WIB, was limited, but the lessons learned in the process would have an impact on future military planning. So what Wilson does is, and what the War Industry Boards highlights, is kind of these short-term government agencies that are going to help mobilize the U.S. for war. And so what Wilson does is assemble the A team. So our first member of the A team is Bernard Baruch, who's a Wall Street broker, and he volunteered to use his extensive contracts in industry to help win the war. Under his direction, the War Industries Board set production priorities and established centralized control over raw materials and prices. So he was in charge of making sure production went smoothly. And of course, Herbert Hoover, who'll become famous as a president, but at this time period, he's a distinguished engineer. And he took charge of the Food Administration Program. What the Food Administration Program did was encourage American households to eat less meat and bread so that more food could be shipped abroad for French and British troops. Uh, and the conservation drive really paid off. It's a great humanitarian win for Hoover, and it's really him at the driving force behind this. And in a 2-year period, shipment of food overseas tripled, actually. So this is a really huge accomplishment for Herbert Hoover. Harry Garfield volunteered to head the Fuel Administration, which directed efforts to save coal. As you can imagine, coal is an important thing to save during war. Non-essential factories were closed, so they didn't have to waste energy. And he implemented daylight savings time for really the first time in order to conserve energy. So thanks a lot for having to make me lose an hour of sleep, Harry. William McAdoo, he was the Treasury Secretary, and he headed the Railroad Administration. And what the Railroad Administration did was it took public control of the railroads to coordinate traffic and promoted standardized railroad equipment. So again, making sure that transportation is much more efficient so they can fight the war or prepare to fight the war. And also William Howard Taft former president, gets in on some of the action, and he helped arbitrate disputes between workers and employers as the head of the National War Labor Board. Labor really won a lot of concessions because they did have a lot of bargaining power during the day. Wages rose, the 8-hour day became more common, and union membership increased. So what these guys are doing, all of these, what is that, 5 men are doing, are they running these temporary government organizations to make sure America is ready to fight. By the end of 1918, you can see American factories had produced 3.5 million rifles, 20 million artillery rounds, 633 million pounds of smokeless gunpowder, 376 million pounds of high explosives, 11,000 of toxic gases, and 21,000 airplane engines. So you don't really need to know these numbers, but what these numbers demonstrate is the industry in the U.S. is pumping to support the war. And here is a graph showing gross domestic product from 1914 to 1920. And the GDP, as you can read, is an indicator of economic health because it is the value of all goods and services made in the U.S. So it's the value of what's being produced in the U.S. And you can see the drastic spike in increase primarily between 1915 and when the U.S. gets involved, just how much the GDP is growing in the United States. So fighting the war, let's do some fast facts. April 6, 1917, the U.S. declared war on Germany, which we talked about in class. June 24th, 1917, the first American troops, known as the American Expeditionary Force, arrives in France. They get the nickname Doughboys. I'm not going to go into too much details about where this name comes from, but one of the jokes was that the American soldiers were needed in 1914, but they didn't rise to the occasion until 1917. So some good history humor there. There's more than 4 million U.S. troops engaged, so large numbers, even though they get into the fighting relatively late. And American combat casualties are thousands, as you can see there. So let's talk a little bit about the American Expeditionary Force. I'm looking at my time. I'm trying to keep it at 10 minutes the best I can. Americans were really eager to fight. They had a very romantic view of war, and they saw it as a great struggle, as is often the case with war, and as many of them will soon learn, is not the reality. And it's reflected by the song Over There. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this song because I'm hoping we can take a look at it in class, but it really gets at the American public sentiments about war and what's going to be happening. And the American Expeditionary Force, AEF, so if you hear me see AEF, that's what I'm referring to, the American Expeditionary Force, was headed by our friend General John Pershing, who I hope you remember is the commander who was sent into Mexico to capture Pancho Villa, even though he never actually did it. So he's given supreme command, and he arrives in France with his troops. Now, they arrived to repel a German offensive near Paris, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and that's really their first fighting. And initially, the AEF was really just used to plug British and French weaknesses, because Pershing and his staff realized pretty early on that the United States was ill prepared to fight a war of this size, and they were ill prepared to transport large numbers of soldiers and necessary equipment to the front. And they had a hard time moving supplies, rations, equipment, and trained soldiers were really in short supply. And the mobilization effort really taxed the limits of the American military at this time. However, the new troops arise, they begin to figure it out, and they eventually are given independent command in the Western Front in 1918. Now let's take a look at some of the major battles. We're first going to take at the first two, the Battle of Churchill Theory, which lasts several days, but we can look at it June 3rd and June 4th. So in May, in the spring of 1918, the German commanding general Erich Ludendorff, probably didn't pronounce that right, decides he's going to have a northern campaign sweeping into Paris. And if he can take Paris, then he thinks he'll win the war. But American soldiers arrive, reinforce the French troops, and as you can see from this propaganda that we'll talk about later on, the Churchill theory is called the turning point of the World War, and you can see America's right in the center of it when you look at your screen, the flag in the middle blazing. Just so everyone knows, I'm pointing to the screen and doing hand motions, even though none of you can see that. And then shortly after, you get the Battle of Blue Wood, which is a campaign from June 1st to the 26th. And this was really conducted by, this was a response to the Battle of Chateau Thierry, and it's a counteroffensive to drive the Germans out of the below woods. And they were the U.S. Marines were under command of James Harbord, and they led the attacks against 4 German positions. And it was some intense fighting, but the Americans eventually proved victorious. And why this is important is really the first big military engagement of the American troops. And in this, Ludendorff, the German commander, he tries to push his men through, but he just can't, and it's a very costly battle. Thousands are wounded or missing in action. Then we're going to jump forward a little bit to the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Well, this was really the final Allied offensive of World War I from the Allied forces, and with over over a million American soldiers participated in this. And I'm looking at my time and I'm seeing I'm already hitting the 11-minute mark. So I'm not going to go into the detail, but what you need to realize, this is the final sweeping action, the final offensive that will last until the end of the war. Quickly, I want to hit on the Harlem Hellfighters. The Harlem Hellfighters, as they were informally known, were the 369th Infantry Regiment that was originally the 15th New York Colored Infantry Regiment. They were a very decorated and successful unit. In the World War I, they had the most time spent in combat. They took heavy casualties, and actually further efforts, the entire unit was awarded the Croix de Guerre, which is the highest award for bravery in the French army. Also, another thing about the Harlem Hellfighters, other than just being some of the biggest, I'm not going to swear, but some of the toughest guys in World War I, is they also kind of helped spread jazz. The band instructor of the 369th, James Reese Europe, played in French clubs all across France because they weren't segregated, and really made jazz popular in Europe. So again, these guys were fighting hard. They spent 191 days in the frontline trenches, more than any American unit, and they were hoping to prove, just briefly, that African Americans had earned the right to be American citizens, and they definitely proved themselves on the battlefield. Now, end of the war. So, end of the war. We all know German signed an armistice on November 11th, 1918. I'm sure none of you will ever forget that the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month, World War I comes to an end. So the big thing about the surrender, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, is they surrender their arms, give up much of their navy, and evacuate occupied territories. So Germany gives up a lot. We'll talk about more of this in class. U.S. combat deaths, 53,402. Total military deaths, on the other hand, are 116,708. So some of you may be asking, why is there this huge discrepancy? And it's because of the 1918 influenza pandemic, which swept across army camps and in the U.S., killed thousands of people, and that's where that extra 60,000 comes from. It's for the influenza. So that's a brief overview of mobilizing for the war and fighting the war, and I look forward to going into more depth with you all in class. So make sure to bring your questions or any other ideas you might have about this. We'll see you then.